They called Lucas Gray untouchable. Billionaire, kingmaker, destroyer. Women begged for his attention, men feared his wrath, and yet he looked at me like I was nothing more than a pawn on his chessboard. That's exactly what I became the night he slid a contract across the table. "Be my fiancé," he said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. "It's not real. You'll play the part, and in return, I'll make sure your debts disappear." I should have walked away. I should have said no. But with rent overdue, 2 jobs barely keeping me alive, and his money offering me freedom, I signed. Just like that, I belonged to Lucas Gray. At least on paper. He set the rules immediately: don't touch him, don't expect affection, don't fall in love. He didn't have to worry about that last one, or so I thought. The first gala should have been easy. Walk in, smile, look like the perfect fiancé. But Lucas didn't hold my hand, didn't even look at me. He only leaned down, his lips brushing my ear, and said, "Don't embarrass me." Cold. Sharp. I hated him for it. Until I tripped on the marble stairs in front of the cameras and every vulture in the room waited for me to fall. Lucas didn't hesitate. His arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me against him like I was something fragile, something worth protecting. His expression was deadly, daring anyone to laugh. And in that instant, I realized something terrifying. Lucas Gray wasn't following his own rules anymore. The cameras flashed so hard I could barely see, but all I could feel was the iron grip of Lucas Gray's arm locked around me, his jaw tight, his body radiating something that felt dangerously close to possession. For a heartbeat the world blurred, the crowd, the stares, the judgmental stares of women in glittering gowns, and there was only him, his hand steady at my waist like it belonged there. When he finally released me, it was abrupt, as if he'd realized what he had done, and the mask slid back into place. The photographers shouted questions, hungry for a reaction, but Lucas only straightened to his full height and moved forward without a single glance back. I followed because I had no choice, my pulse hammering, my legs weak. By the time we reached the car, I thought maybe I had imagined it, that flash of heat, that moment where he looked at me like I was more than a contract, more than a pawn. But then, when the door closed and silence swallowed us inside, he turned his head ever so slightly. "Keep your head high next time," he said, voice calm, cool, almost bored. Like the man who had just shielded me in front of half the city had never existed. I wanted to argue, wanted to demand an explanation, but the words died in my throat because his eyes lingered on mine for a second too long before he looked away, rolling down the divider so he didn't have to see me anymore. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, telling myself over and over it meant nothing. He was a man who didn't believe in love, didn't even believe in companionship beyond its usefulness. And yet, something inside me shifted, no matter how much I resisted it. Over the next week, the weight of pretending to be Lucas Gray's fiancée grew heavier than I imagined. The public adored the story, him finally settling down, me the mysterious nobody suddenly vaulted into the spotlight. But in private, Lucas kept his distance. He never touched me unless there were eyes on us. He never smiled, never asked how I was handling the attention, never gave me a single hint that I was anything more than a name on a contract. But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him staring. Not soft, not tender, but sharp, like he was dissecting me, trying to figure out why I was even there. And then the whispers started. His ex, a woman named Victoria who carried herself like a queen in exile, returned with perfect timing. She wore her cruelty like perfume, subtle but impossible to ignore, brushing past me at one gala to murmur, "Don't get comfortable. Lucas doesn't keep anyone for long." I told myself I didn't care. I told myself it was true. But when I saw the way Victoria pressed a manicured hand to his chest and leaned in too close, something inside me twisted. I looked away before I could see if he pushed her off. Later, in the car ride home, Lucas was silent, his gaze fixed out the window. I tried to ignore the sting in my chest, but when his phone buzzed and Victoria's name flashed across the screen, my stomach sank. He didn't answer. Instead, he slid the phone into his jacket pocket, his jaw clenching just slightly, and in the reflection of the window I thought I saw his eyes flick toward me. That night I realized I was falling for him, against every rule he had set, against every piece of logic I had. I didn't want to. I couldn't afford to. But there was something in the way Lucas Gray's walls cracked when no one else was looking, something in the way he caught me without hesitation, something in the way he stayed silent but never once left me behind. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. What I didn't know, what terrified me most, was whether Lucas Gray felt anything at all. Because if he did, if those cracks in his armor meant something, then I was playing with fire. And if he didn't, then I was already burned. The next morning I told myself I would stay distant, that I would treat Lucas Gray like the contract employer he was, nothing more, nothing less. But every time we stepped into a room together, every time I caught the weight of his presence beside me, my resolve faltered. The world bowed to him, powerful men lowering their voices when he walked past, women straightening their posture to be noticed, and yet it was me who carried his name on my arm, me who had to smile as if I belonged. I kept telling myself that it was all pretend, that the way my heart raced whenever his hand brushed mine in public was a symptom of the act we were performing, nothing else. But then came the night he arrived home later than usual, his tie undone, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. I had been waiting in the lounge like the perfect fiancé for when his staff passed by, trying not to fall asleep on the velvet couch. When he entered, I stood, ready to retreat and give him space, but he surprised me by stopping in front of me, loosening his cufflinks with a sharp tug. For a long moment he just looked at me, and I couldn't read him. His gaze was sharp but tired, heavy but unguarded. It was the first time I realized he wasn't just cold, he was human, and maybe more alone than I'd ever imagined. He finally spoke, his voice low and rougher than usual. "You don't have to wait up. This isn't real, remember?" I should have nodded, excused myself, gone back to my room. Instead I heard myself say, "I know. But maybe I wanted to." His eyes narrowed just slightly, and something like a question hung between us, but he didn't pursue it. He turned away, dismissing me, but I knew I'd seen something. A crack. The next day at a luncheon with investors, I felt the sting of whispered comments when I walked by, women in jewels disguising their cruelty with laughter. One of them muttered that I was a charity case, a convenient shield for Lucas until he returned to Victoria. My chest burned, but I kept my head high, remembering his words. When we sat at the table, Lucas noticed the tension even if he didn't ask. He leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable, but when the same woman tried to bait me in conversation, he cut in sharply, dismantling her with one dry remark that silenced the entire group. The room fell quiet, and I caught the flicker of something protective in his eyes before he looked away as though it cost him nothing. Later, in the car, I tried to thank him for what you said back there. He interrupted with that same cold edge. "Don't thank me. It was necessary." His tone was detached, but his hand rested briefly on the seat beside mine, close enough to feel deliberate. I stayed silent, torn between relief and frustration. Days blurred into nights, each event binding us closer in the eyes of the world, but further confusing me in private. Then came the evening Victoria returned in full force, sweeping into the gallery opening with a smile that could slice glass. She greeted Lucas with too much familiarity, ignoring me entirely. I stood at his side, hands clasped, while she leaned in and murmured something I couldn't hear. His jaw tightened, but he didn't step back. My stomach twisted, and for the first time since this arrangement began, I felt the urge to run. She finally turned to me, her smile dripping venom. "So this is the fiancé. How quaint. I wonder how long you'll last." I forced myself to smile back, refusing to give her the satisfaction, but her words lingered long after she walked away. That night in the car, Lucas sat in silence again, but this time I couldn't bear it. "She still matters to you, doesn't she?" My voice cracked more than I wanted. He didn't look at me, didn't answer. The silence was worse than anything he could have said. I turned to the window, vowing not to let him see the tears that threatened to fall. Yet as the city lights blurred past, I felt the faintest brush of his hand against mine, quick and fleeting like he wasn't sure he had the right. My breath caught, but before I could react, he pulled his hand back and leaned into the shadows, pretending it never happened. And that was the cruelest part, he could shield me in public, protect me from insults, even touch me when the world was watching, but when it was just the two of us, he refused to give me anything real. Still, in the hollow silence of the ride home, I knew one thing for certain. Lucas Gray was breaking his own rules, and sooner or later, something would shatter. The morning after the gallery I promised myself I would stop reading into every glance and every silence, but it was impossible when Lucas Gray kept giving me contradictions. He was a man of rules, strict and sharp, but more and more I caught glimpses of something else. One evening we attended a charity dinner in the heart of the city, the kind where the air smelled of old money and secrets. I felt every stare, every whisper. Victoria was there again, radiant and cruel, and she didn't waste a second before cornering me in the ladies' lounge. She smiled into the mirror as she fixed her lipstick and said, "Don't mistake protection for affection. Lucas has always been like this, he shields what he owns. That's all you are." Her words pierced deeper than I wanted to admit. I left before she could see me falter, rejoining Lucas at the table. He barely glanced at me, but when he noticed the tremor in my hand as I lifted my glass, his eyes sharpened. He leaned close enough that only I could hear. "What did she say?" His voice was low, dangerous. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Nothing." He studied me for a long second, like he knew I was lying, but he didn't press. Instead, when dessert was served, he casually reached under the table and rested his hand against my knee, firm, steady, possessive. He didn't look at me once, didn't acknowledge it, but the weight of that simple touch made my pulse race so violently I thought the whole room could hear. Later, when the dinner ended and we slipped into the car, he withdrew his hand as if it had never happened. I wanted to scream at him for it, for giving me pieces of something I couldn't name, then tearing them away before I could understand. That night I lay awake again, hating myself for falling deeper. A week later, we found ourselves at yet another gala, this one held in a glass tower overlooking the city. The room glittered with chandeliers and diamonds, the kind of place where every smile hid a dagger. Lucas was soon pulled into a circle of executives, leaving me by the champagne table. That was when an investor I had never met approached, his confidence radiating before he even spoke. He introduced himself as Adrian, his eyes sliding over me in a way that made my skin crawl. "So you're the fiancé," he said smoothly. Funny, I didn't think Lucas's type would be quite so interesting. His gaze lingered, and before I could respond, he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If you ever get tired of being part of his game, you should call me. I promise I play fair." My stomach tightened, and I opened my mouth to shut him down, but before I could, a shadow fell across us. Lucas stood behind me, silent and deadly, his hand sliding around my waist with deliberate force. His voice was calm, almost too calm, when he said, "She's not available." Adrian chuckled like it was a joke, but one look at Lucas's eyes, the cold fire burning there, was enough to silence him. Without another word, Lucas guided me away, his hand never leaving my side until we reached the car. Inside, the air was thick. He didn't look at me, but the tension in his body was unmistakable. Finally, I whispered, "You didn't have to." His head turned, his gaze sharp enough to pin me to the seat. "Yes. I did." He said nothing else the entire ride, but his hand remained on mine the whole way home, and for the first time, I realized Lucas Gray was capable of jealousy. And it scared me more than anything. The realization of Lucas's jealousy unsettled me more than anything else that had happened since the contract began. He wasn't supposed to care. He wasn't supposed to feel anything. Yet the way he had appeared behind me at that gala, silent but radiating fury, told me otherwise. I replayed it over and over, the heat of his hand at my waist, the deadly calm in his voice as he dismissed Adrian like he was nothing. I wanted to believe it meant something, but every time I thought I understood him, he slammed the door shut again. Over the following days he became even more unreadable. Around his staff and business partners, he was the same cold, calculating man the world feared. Around me, he was sharper than ever, his gaze lingering but his words cutting. It was like he was punishing himself for what happened at the gala, for letting something real slip through. One evening, we attended a private dinner hosted by one of his board members, an opulent affair in a mansion that smelled of money and power. The women whispered behind silk fans, their eyes on me with thinly veiled disdain. I felt every daggered glance, every curl of a painted lip. When I excused myself to the terrace to breathe, Victoria was already there, swirling her wine glass as though she'd been waiting. "Did you enjoy your little moment the other night?" she asked without looking at me. "Lucas does that sometimes, he likes to stake a claim, just to keep people in line. Don't confuse it with devotion." I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to react, but she didn't stop. "He'll grow tired of you." "He always does." I turned to leave, but her hand brushed my arm, her voice dropping lower. "And when he does, don't expect him to soften the fall." My chest burned as I walked back inside, head high, but my legs shook. Lucas was waiting near the doorway, his eyes narrowing as soon as he saw my face. He didn't ask in front of anyone. He simply guided me back to the table, his hand steady at the small of my back. For the rest of the night, he didn't leave my side, his attention a shield I both resented and craved. Later, in the car, he finally broke the silence. "What did she say to you?" His tone was low, but I could feel the storm beneath it. I shook my head. "It doesn't matter." He didn't accept that. His hand tightened around the steering wheel, his jaw flexing. "If she crosses you again, you tell me." I stared at him, unable to stop myself. "Why? Why does it matter to you?" For a long second he said nothing, and I thought he would retreat again into silence. But then his eyes flicked to mine, and what I saw there stole the air from my lungs. Anger. Possession. And something else he wasn't ready to name. "Because it does," he said finally, voice rougher than I had ever heard it. He looked away before I could respond, as though he regretted saying even that much. The rest of the ride was quiet, but the air between us was alive, sparking with something we both tried and failed to ignore. That night I admitted to myself what I had been denying since the first time he caught me on those marble steps. I had fallen for him. Not in some fairy tale way, not in some over-the-top declaration, but in the quiet, aching way that settled in my bones. And I hated myself for it, because Lucas Gray was a man who didn't bend, who didn't love, who didn't need anyone. Yet when I closed my eyes, all I could see was his hand on mine, his voice when he said yes, I did. I was falling, and I couldn't stop. The question was whether he would ever let himself fall too, or if I was destined to crash alone. The weeks that followed were a blur of appearances, each more grueling than the last. Lucas pulled me into his world as though I had always belonged there, but in private he kept his distance, leaving me starved for clarity. The media fed on us like vultures, headlines screaming about the mysterious fiancé no one could place, analysts speculating on how long I would last before Lucas discarded me like the others. I tried to block it out, but their words echoed my own fears. At a winter gala dripping with diamonds and power, everything came to a breaking point. I wore a dress Lucas's assistant had chosen, shimmering silver that clung to me like armor, but I felt small under the weight of their stares. The evening dragged on, each introduction more suffocating than the last, until I found myself cornered by a pair of women whose laughter was as sharp as glass. One of them leaned close, her perfume cloying, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts. Lucas is only parading you around because it's convenient. He'll always go back to Victoria." The sting was instant, but I forced a smile, pretending their words didn't pierce straight through. When I turned, I found Lucas watching from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze burned, and before I could move, he was striding toward us. The crowd parted around him, silence following in his wake. He stopped beside me, his hand sliding to the small of my back with deliberate possession, and in a voice low enough to silence the entire group, he said, "If anyone here thinks my fiancé is temporary, they can take it up with me. The venom in his tone made the women shrink back instantly, their painted smiles faltering. My breath caught, my heart hammering. He had never defended me so openly, never shattered his carefully crafted detachment in front of this many people. When he guided me away, his hand firm at my side, I didn't know if I wanted to cry or collapse. The ride home was quiet, but the silence between us wasn't the same as before. It pulsed, charged with the memory of what he had just done. I finally found the courage to whisper, "Why did you say that?" Lucas didn't look at me, but his hand was still on mine, his thumb brushing once, almost absent-minded. Because they were wrong. 3 words, simple and raw, but they left me breathless. I wanted to press, to ask what I meant to him beyond the contract, but I couldn't. He had already turned away, retreating into himself again. Later that night, long after he disappeared into his office, I sat in my room replaying his words, his tone, the weight of his hand. For the first time since this arrangement began, I wondered if I wasn't the only one breaking the rules. If Lucas Gray, the man who swore he would never fall, was already halfway to the edge, and didn't know how to stop. The empire Lucas had built with precision began to show cracks just as I was starting to believe he might feel something real. Rumors of a hostile takeover spread like fire, lawsuits surfaced from every direction, and the media swarmed to predict his downfall. For the first time since I had met him, Lucas looked tired. He carried the weight of the city on his shoulders, his suit still immaculate but his eyes darker, the edges of his control fraying. I should have kept my distance, let him fight his battles alone, but when I found him one night sitting in his office with the lights off, glass of whiskey in his hand, something inside me refused to walk away. He looked up at me like he hadn't expected anyone to follow. "You should sleep," he said, his voice low, heavy. "You don't need to see me like this." I stayed by the door, unsure if I had the right to step closer. "Maybe I do," I whispered, surprising even myself. He didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed on me, unreadable, and for a moment I thought he would send me away. But then he sighed, leaning back in his chair, the mask slipping in the dim light. "Do you know what happens when you give people power?" he asked softly. "They use it to destroy you. Every single time." The bitterness in his tone was sharper than anything I'd heard before. I moved closer, my voice unsteady. "Not everyone." He gave a humorless laugh, tilting his head back. "Name one person." My throat tightened. I could have said myself, but the words lodged in my chest. Instead, I just stood there, close enough to smell the whiskey, close enough to see how exhausted he really was. For the first time, Lucas Gray didn't look like a man untouchable. He looked like someone who was bleeding behind the armor. His eyes met mine again, and something in them shook me to my core, fear, anger, and a loneliness so raw it made my chest ache. I reached out, my hand brushing against his, and for a terrifying second he didn't pull away. He let me touch him, his fingers curling slightly around mine before he caught himself and pulled back. "Don't," he said sharply, but his voice cracked halfway through, betraying him. Silence stretched heavy between us, but it was different this time. He had shown me too much to take back, and we both knew it. I left him there, heart pounding, and when I closed the door I pressed my back against it, trembling. Lucas Gray wasn't just breaking his rules anymore. He was unraveling, and whether I liked it or not, I was the reason. The morning after that night in his office, Lucas was colder than ever. He barely spoke to me, his replies clipped and precise, his presence like steel walls built higher overnight. If anyone else had seen him, they would have thought nothing had changed, but I knew better. He was retreating because he had let me see too much. I told myself I wouldn't care, that I'd stop trying to read meaning into every glance, every slip in his armor, but it was useless. I had already fallen, and now every distance he put between us cut deeper than it should have. At another event days later, the whispers followed us more viciously than before. The Empire's troubles were no secret, and the world could smell blood in the water. Reporters speculated about mergers, rivals circled like sharks, and Victoria made her move, her arm brushing his as she leaned in to speak. My chest ached when I saw how close she stood, her hand lingering on his sleeve, her smile practiced and perfect. I forced myself to turn away, but when I did, I caught the reflection of Lucas's eyes in the window across from us. He wasn't looking at her, he was watching me, sharp and unyielding, as if daring me to believe her presence mattered. That night, back at the penthouse, I wanted to demand answers, to force him to admit something, anything. But when I entered the living room, he was on a call, his voice cold and commanding as he cut down an executive threatening to walk. I froze, watching him from the doorway, and when he finally ended the call, the exhaustion in his posture nearly broke me. "Lucas," I whispered, but he didn't turn. "Go to bed," he said flatly. The words should have ended it, but the way his shoulders slumped betrayed him. I walked closer, defying every warning in my head. "You don't have to do this alone." For the first time he turned to me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried something raw. "Yes, I do," he said, though his voice was quieter, weaker. I wanted to close the distance, to make him see that I wasn't another enemy waiting to strike, but before I could, he looked away again, ending it. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I should walk away before I broke any further. But then I remembered the way he had defended me, the way his voice had cracked when he told me not to touch him, the way he had looked at me through the glass when Victoria was at his side. Every piece of him told me to stop, but every action told me he couldn't let go. I was trapped between his silence and his truths, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. The pressure surrounding Lucas's empire grew heavier with every passing day, and it felt like I was living inside a storm. He was stretched thin, his time consumed by lawyers, meetings, and phone calls that ended with slammed doors and clenched fists. He carried himself as if nothing could break him, but I had seen too much to believe that lie anymore. I had seen the cracks in the armor, the exhaustion etched into his eyes when he thought no one was watching, the way his hand trembled ever so slightly when he reached for his glass late at night. And yet, even with his world crumbling, Lucas Gray never stopped protecting me. He shielded me at every event, his hand firm at the small of my back, his presence a wall between me and the whispers that grew sharper each time we appeared in public. But the more he protected me, the more it hurt, because I couldn't stop asking myself whether I was protection or distraction. Whether I was someone he cared about or simply another role to play in his endless war. One night, after another grueling charity dinner, I found him in the library of the penthouse, a half-empty glass of whiskey beside him, his tie discarded and shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment, the weight of his gaze pinned me to the spot. His eyes were darker than usual, his face shadowed by something more than exhaustion. I hesitated, but then I stepped closer, my voice quiet. "You don't have to keep this all inside." He gave a humorless laugh, one that sounded nothing like him. "If I don't, I won't have anything left." He set the glass down with more force than necessary, his jaw tight. "Do you have any idea how many people would tear me apart the second I show weakness? They're already circling. Waiting." I swallowed hard, my chest tight. "And yet you let me see it." His head snapped toward me, his eyes burning. "That's the problem," he said, his voice rough. The silence that followed was unbearable. My heart pounded as I searched his face, and for the first time I saw fear there. Not fear of failure, not fear of ruin, but fear of me, of what I meant to him. Slowly, as if against his own will, he admitted, "You shouldn't matter this much." My breath caught, the air between us heavy and charged. He raked a hand through his hair, his control unraveling. "I don't let people in. Not my family, not my so-called friends, not anyone. But you," he stopped himself, shaking his head as though the words were poison. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Then why not just admit it?" His eyes locked on mine, and for one terrifying, breathtaking second, I thought he would. I thought he would close the distance between us and say what we had both been dancing around since the beginning. But instead he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his control snapping back into place. "You should go," he said, his tone sharp, final. My chest ached as I turned and left the room, but just as I reached the door, I heard his voice again, softer, broken, like he hadn't meant for me to hear. "Because if I do, I won't stop." I froze, my heart hammering, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. That night I lay in bed replaying those words, every syllable branded into me. Lucas Gray was fighting something bigger than both of us, something he couldn't admit without losing the careful empire he had built. But I also knew this, his walls weren't impenetrable anymore. And if he truly let himself fall, it wouldn't be measured or controlled. It would be reckless, all-consuming, impossible to reverse. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just in danger of being hurt. I was in danger of being the one thing that could unravel him completely. The days that followed were unbearable. Lucas grew sharper, colder, his walls rebuilt higher than before, but the more he tried to shut me out, the more obvious it became that he was slipping. He carried himself with the same ruthless composure in front of his board, his enemies, and the media, but in the quiet of the penthouse I saw it, the tension in his jaw when he thought I wasn't watching, the way his gaze lingered on me when he believed I was asleep, the heaviness in his sighs when the phone calls ended and the mask no longer had an audience. Every contradiction tore at me. I wanted to hate him for the way he pushed me away, for the way he left me drowning in questions, but the truth was that every stolen glance, every unspoken moment only pulled me in deeper. And then came the night it all broke. We had been scheduled to attend another gala, this one hosted by one of Lucas's oldest rivals, a man who would have sold his soul for a chance to see him humiliated. I had dressed carefully, telling myself I wouldn't let their whispers or their cruel smiles touch me this time. But the moment we arrived, I knew it would be worse than ever. Victoria was there, of course, dazzling in crimson, her smile sharp as she floated across the room. She didn't come to me right away. She circled first, weaving between groups of men and women, her gaze flicking toward Lucas as if to remind me she knew him better than I ever could. When she finally approached, her glass of champagne shimmering in the light, I braced myself. She leaned close, her voice honeyed poison. "Do you know what everyone is saying? That you're the distraction he's using to buy himself time. That when this all collapses, and it will, he'll walk away, and you'll be nothing more than a footnote." Her words sank like lead into my chest, but before I could reply, another voice joined the circle. Adrian, the investor from before, appeared with a grin that made my skin crawl. "She's right, you know. Lucas doesn't play well with others. But if you ever want a safer option, my door's open." The table laughed, the sound cruel, and for the first time I felt my facade crack. I wanted to vanish, to escape their eyes, but before I could, the laughter stopped. The room fell silent as Lucas appeared at my side, his expression carved from stone. Without hesitation, he slid his arm around my waist, pulling me flush against him, his grip unyielding. His voice was low, lethal, and carried across the room like a blade. "The next person who questions her place beside me won't have one of their own tomorrow." The threat hung heavy in the air, and no one dared laugh again. Victoria's smile faltered, Adrian's eyes widened, and I stood frozen, my pulse thundering as Lucas's words echoed in my head. He didn't release me until we were outside, the cold night air biting against my skin. The car door closed behind us, sealing us in, and the silence was suffocating. I stared at him, searching his face, but he refused to meet my eyes, his jaw tight, his hand still resting on mine as though he couldn't bring himself to let go. Finally, I broke the silence. "Why do you keep doing this?" My voice shook despite myself. "Why do you protect me like that, then shut me out the second we're alone?" His gaze snapped to mine, and for once there was no mask, no calculation, only raw fury and something deeper, something I had been aching to see. "Because I can't stand the thought of them touching you," he said, his voice rough, almost a growl. "I can't stand the way they look at you, the way they talk about you, as if you're anything less than what you are." My chest tightened painfully, the world narrowing down to just him, his words, the heat of his hand gripping mine. "Then say it," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Say what I am to you." For a long second, he didn't move, didn't speak, and I thought he would retreat again, vanish behind his walls. But then his hand slid to my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin with a tenderness that shattered me. His eyes burned into mine, and when he spoke, his voice was raw and unguarded. "You're the only thing that matters." The words ripped through me, leaving me breathless. Before I could respond, his mouth was on mine, fierce and desperate, like a man who had been starving for far too long. His kiss wasn't careful or controlled. It was possession, confession, and surrender all at once. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, his voice was a vow. "I don't care about the rules anymore. I don't care about what this costs me. I won't let you go." For the first time, Lucas Gray had broken every one of his rules. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I had fallen for him quietly, carefully, against my better judgment. But he had fallen harder, and now that he had, there was no turning back. After that night, nothing was the same. Lucas didn't pretend anymore, not in front of me, not in front of anyone who dared to question us. The world still whispered, still circled like wolves around his empire, but he didn't care, not when it came to me. He no longer kept the careful distance that had once left me aching. Instead, he made it clear in every possible way that I was his. His hand on mine at every event, his presence an unshakable shield, his words sharp enough to cut down anyone who tried to humiliate me. And for all the restraint he once prided himself on, he no longer held back when we were alone. The cold, untouchable man I had signed a contract with was gone, replaced by someone who burned for me so fiercely it was almost frightening. But with his surrender came the storm. Victoria grew bolder, desperate in her schemes to reclaim what she thought was hers, feeding the media rumors and lies meant to break us. Adrian whispered to the press about how Lucas had grown reckless, how his obsession was clouding his judgment. The board grew restless, questioning his every move as lawsuits piled up. And still Lucas stood firm, refusing to let them touch me, refusing to let me walk away even when I begged him to protect himself instead. One night, after another barrage of attacks in the news, I confronted him in his office. "You're throwing away everything you built for me," I said, my voice breaking. "Do you realize that?" He looked up from his desk, his tie loose, his eyes burning with something I had never seen so clearly before. "Yes," he said simply. "And I'd do it again." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "Lucas, this isn't you. You don't break the rules. You don't let anyone close. You don't," he cut me off, standing so suddenly the chair scraped against the floor. "I don't let anyone close because I can't afford to. But you," his voice cracked, his chest rising and falling with every breath. "You make me want things I swore I would never need. And I don't know how to stop." The vulnerability in his face undid me. He wasn't just a man with power and money and enemies. He was a man who had built walls so high he never thought anyone could climb them, and now that I had, he was willing to burn the entire fortress down just to keep me inside. The final blow came at a shareholder meeting, when Victoria, Adrian, and several others launched their coordinated strike, presenting evidence and lies meant to remove him from his own empire. The room was a battlefield of polished smiles and sharpened words, but Lucas didn't flinch. He stood before them, calm and steady, his hand linked with mine for everyone to see. "You want to take my company, fine," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "But you will never take her from me. And if you think you can, try." The board fell silent, stunned by the man who once lived by nothing but control and power, now throwing it all away in defense of someone they had dismissed as temporary. And in that silence, something shifted. Not everyone turned on him. Some respected the steel in his voice, the fire in his defiance. Enough to keep him standing, battered but not broken. When the meeting ended and the room emptied, he pulled me into his arms in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, his voice raw against my ear. "I don't care if I lose everything else. You're the only thing I can't afford to lose." I clung to him, my heart pounding, the weight of what we had survived crashing over me. I had fallen first, quietly, against my will. But Lucas Gray had fallen harder, recklessly, completely, and now there was no world where either of us would ever be the same. In the end, the empire still stood, though scarred, and so did we. The man who once swore he would never need anyone had unraveled before my eyes, and in his ruin I found the truth. Lucas Gray was out of control, and he was mine.